Oren, it's good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, could you start by walking us through some of the key moments that have defined your career in AI?
Well, I'm old. I've had a long career. How much time do you have?
We have hopefully the next 8 hours of your calendar are free because we have a lot to get into.
I'll give the short version. So I think actually things start with for me at the end of high school when I read the book Gödel Escher Bach, which talked about meta mathematics and music and artificial intelligence, and really got me thinking about what are the most profound questions that I can think about for the rest of my career. I then went to college where I majored in computer science. I was actually the first person in my college to major in computer science. But what was interesting is I didn't take a ton of computer science classes. I knew I was going to be a professor, so I figured I can always continue to learn. And instead, I took as many psychology classes, particularly cognitive psychology and philosophy classes, as I could: philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, ethics. And I just loved it. I found it very, very inspiring. So much so that when it came time to go to grad school, that I was asking myself, should I go to grad school in philosophy or should I go to grad school in computer science? And I ultimately saw that a lot of the people I knew who were going into grad school in philosophy were ending up working in things like moving. There were no jobs in philosophy. And yet there were a lot of fascinating philosophical questions in computer science, particularly in AI. So I figured I'll learn to do AI. I'll have a reasonable standard of living, and I'll still be able to delve into philosophy as much as I can. So I went and I did my PhD in computer science. I did
And
one
there
of
was
the
poetry somewhere along the way there too.
Yes, this is, if we're going to get into that, then it's a whole nother thing. Yeah, I was completely fascinated with poetry, the humanities. I really tried extracurricular stuff. I really tried to squeeze in as much as I could. Uh, I loved a cappella singing groups. I can't sing, but I can listen. Uh, but let's not go there. So I did one of the first PhDs in machine learning from Tom Mitchell, who's one of the forefathers of the field. Jeff Hinton, who recently won the Turing Award, was there actually as a visiting professor talking about this kind of obscure thing called neural networks. And it was very controversial at the time. And of course, neural networks couldn't really do anything. So it seemed like a real question. Things are very different now. And from there, I went into academia. I became a professor at University of Washington. This is now 1991. I also started some companies, started some nonprofits. We can talk about that in more detail. But if I look back and I try to summarize it all, I would say that I was really focused on a couple of key themes in here. One is that what we do shouldn't just be fun, shouldn't just be a fun technical puzzle or a fun intellectual puzzle. It should also have an impact. So I often ask myself as I was working on stuff, is this important? Is this fundamentally interesting? Or is this just some kind of cool hack? And a cool hack can be a cool philosophical argument that doesn't really deliver deep insights, but is just fascinating technically. It could be a cool technical hack. I was always asking, why are we doing this and what's going to be the impact? So I would say that was one huge theme. And related to that was this question of the balance between asking conceptual questions and actually building things. And I became less interested in philosophy because I felt like the methodology was one that had virtues, it absolutely does, but it wasn't constructive enough for me. I wanted to build things that were tangible, you could touch, that people could use, that would have that kind of impact. So I spent a lot of my career working with students, both undergrads, grad students at UW, people at startups and so on, who are often alumni from UW, building things. And that takes us all the way to 2024 and True Media, where we built something. I know we'll talk about that. So I'll stop my long rambling answer here.
And I know you met with President Biden a couple years back to talk about AI risks. What was that experience like for you, and what advice did you offer him?
It was really quite an experience because all out of the blue, I get an email saying President Biden is going to be in San Francisco. Would you come to a small meeting with some AI leaders to kind of inform him and talk to him about AI, moonshot projects, risks, just give him the flavor of what's going on. It was a very unique opportunity, and so I flew there. It was at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, and I got there a little bit early the night before, and I watch how they turn a hotel, right, which is a place for tourists, into a fortress for the president to be in, and it was just fascinating to see how they did that. And then I went into the room. And there's all these little details. I'll just give you one where it was like I was like, oh, would I be able to use the bathroom? And they're like, actually, no. It says when the president is moving or the president is somewhere, you can't just move around, right? There's very, very strict security protocols and so on. So I was like, okay, I better go to the bathroom before the talk. We went into the room, and I got to meet the president, and I was very impressed with him. There were a lot of questions that arose about his acuity and so on, and I think obviously deteriorated later. But in the conversation that I was with him, there was about maybe 10 of us, or AI folks from Stanford, from various places, myself, and there were also the governor of California, his chief of staff, people like that. So it's a very interesting group. And we all went around and had a chance to give a 1 or 2 minute spiel, story, anecdote about something that we're very passionate about. And I actually talked about AI as assistive intelligence. I was trying to make the case that as we get older, as we see people who are disabled, who are challenged with seeing, with hearing, with walking, AI can really help. And he I think gave a good answer to that. But something funny happened on the way to the forum, to use that phrase, which is another person who was there brought up the issue of deepfakes. And he was talking about how they've become easier to use, easier to create, and how they can affect the markets, how they can affect our democracy, and how they were a huge concern. So I came in with, hey, let's have the government, right, do kind of a Manhattan Project in building assistive technology using AI. But I came out and there were a bunch of people with a bunch of ideas. Again, we don't have time for. They were all fascinating. I thought the president was very sharp in questioning us. But I came out really worried about what Tristan Harris was bringing up, which is could this technology be used to subvert elections and to influence the markets? And he gave the example of a fake photo of the Pentagon being bombed that caused a drop in the markets. So I became absolutely fascinated with, well, why don't we build the tool, particularly using modern AI technology? We have generative AI generating these deepfakes. Well, what if we had AI to detect them? And I was very fortunate to get connected with Garrett Camp, the co-founder of Uber, who was willing to fund that effort. And again, it takes time. So it took 6 months for me to do my homework, for me to put together the idea, for me to pitch it to Garrett Camp, for him to accept it. And January 2024, we launched into the project. I was able to quickly put together a team. A lot of folks were volunteers, some folks were interns. Everybody took as a very substantially reduced salary if they were working on this. And we're all passionate about two things. One is the mission, but the other one's the urgency, because 2024 was a year where over 1 billion people went to the polls in Indonesia, in India, in Japan, in Brazil, in Europe, everywhere, and of course in the United States in November. And we were able to build a state-of-the-art tool that was used quite extensively all over the world, and certainly in our election in November.
And now let's talk a bit about artificial intelligence. You've said many times, quote, never mistake a clear view for a short distance. And you say that in the context of referring to the development of artificial general intelligence. So, what does that clear view look like for you? And what are, say, some of the landmarks you'd point to that we should look out for? And what are things you think we should not really expect to see?
The clear view is actually a philosophical point, which is when we think about it conceptually, assuming that we're materialists, we believe everything is made of atoms, there is no basis for believing that we cannot build in silicon or in computers, we cannot build an intelligence. So this has actually been a topic of some debate over the years, but my belief is that philosophically we can get there. So that's the clear view. We're going to build human level intelligence. Once we build that, it's easy to see how it'll catapult itself into super intelligence. And we're going to have some very, very powerful intelligences that we've never had before. Now, that's the clear view. The short distances, people see something like ChatGPT and its ilk, which is pretty amazing, and they say, okay, it's around the corner. And it's really not. There's a lot of work to do, both to put it into application in various places and even to really achieve human level intelligence. And again, to give a quick sense of why that's the case, I like to point to a famous quote by Pablo Picasso: computers are useless. They just answer questions, right? And of course, he was not privy to ChatGPT, but he might say the same thing about the current AI systems. They answer questions, but they don't formulate the problem. They don't ask the questions. They don't have the judgment to decide what's really important. And as a result, even though they can generate reams and reams of text and plans and music and fake videos and what have you, how many outstanding papers have they written? So I think this will happen, but we're still a ways from an AI system on its own, conceptualizing, generating, writing, and publishing a best paper award at a premier scientific conference.
I actually want to go to that quote a bit. Right now, it's primarily used for I ask it a question and it gives me the answer. But if, as it gives me the answer, it also itself, gives some directions and really questions what we're doing on any level, is that sufficient to overcome this hurdle, or is there something we're looking for that even that wouldn't be capturing?
I would say the analogy is, can it play chess? And it's already impressive that an AI program of any kind can play chess. And can it play chess at a grandmaster level and beat the world champion? So already when you go to deep research, it often asks you some follow-up questions. And if you were to tell it, hey, generate for me some questions, ask me 50 questions, give me 100 topics for cutting edge philosophy papers, whether it's a term paper or a published one, it'll respond. But it's the quality of what comes back, which often reminds one of wet cardboard. That's the problem. So I think that it doesn't have the judgment to ask good questions.
And my understanding of your general view of AI is that it's fairly optimistic. We're a while away from something like artificial general intelligence, whatever that could look like. But broadly, I think you believe that AI will bring a lot of benefits in healthcare and mitigating the impacts of climate change and helping people with disabilities, as we just discussed. And we are going to have hiccups and challenges along the way, right? There's going to be a problem of, say, deepfakes, and we're going to have like True Media and other companies trying to stop that. What would be the signs that this general optimistic view in, say, 10 years is turning out to be right or turning out to be wrong? That, oh, it looks like we've missed something. We really have to think about this again.
That's a wonderful question. And let me start by qualifying a little bit where I stand. The general discourse of AI, whether it's in Hollywood or in the press or in conversations with people, is very, very negative. And in response to that, I try to point out the positives, right? People have all kinds of doomsday scenarios, but they don't think about, for example, how AI could save us from doomsday scenarios, whether it's the next pandemic could be a lot more deadly and AI will generate the vaccine, superbugs, climate change. We are facing as humanity very thorny problems, and AI is actually a huge enabler for the solution. So I like to point out that it's balanced. There's potential risks, but there are also these potential opportunities. That said, I do have a lot of concerns. Deepfakes and its effect on democracy is one. There's concerns about jobs, about privacy, about how dictatorial regimes can use AI very, very effectively. The thing that I like to point out is that it's people using AI for nefarious means. So whenever you have powerful technology, and of course computers themselves are this and software are these very powerful technologies, you see how it's used for good, used for bad. Look at the internet, right? It's a tremendous enabler for humanity, but it's also used to propagate child pornography, right? Very vile, illegal things. So it's really tricky. And the point that I really try to emphasize is not that AI is inherently good or AI is inherently bad, but it's up to us uh, to use it in the right way. And my optimism and pessimism sometimes shifts with my view of society. So when I feel like society, like our society, is not doing very well at making good decisions, and we'll just leave it at that, then I worry that AI will become part of that. And when I feel like, no, we can come together and make good decisions. We'll make mistakes, but over time we will improve and evolve. Then I feel more optimistic. To me, the key point, and this is the biggest one, is to understand that AI is a tool, and the choice is ours.
So let's talk about that actually. You've urged people to think of AI as a tool and not as like an independent being or force. And it makes sense to me as to why we would want it to only be a tool because, like, having AI doctors, judges, or artists, that brings a lot of moral, legal, and philosophical concerns compared to if we just have AI there to give people guidance, but ultimately it is a conscious human being making the decisions at the end of the day. So I understand why we would want it to just be a tool, but why should we think that it will ultimately only amount to being a tool instead of something greater than that?
A couple of points before I address your question. I do want to highlight that people making these decisions are notoriously fallible. And it's not that, judges can disagree with each other. It's that studies show that they rule differently before lunch when they're kind of hungry and cranky than after they've had a good meal, which clearly is not rational. People are the ones driving responsible for 40,000 deaths on our highways, American highways, each year consistently, 2 million accidents. So people are not the be all and end all. And actually, my dream, my utopian vision of the use of these tools is for people to use this to help them do a better job. In so many ways, whether it's on the road saving lives or even a judge using it and so on. So I do think the person should ultimately be in charge for ethical reasons and because the technology is far from foolproof. It can hallucinate. It can make some terrible mistakes. That said, I think it can really lift our performance problems as humanity. But now to your question, why do I think it's a tool, not a being? I I think that this does go into the realm of philosophy, and I would say that when I look at everything that we've built, I see it very much behaving in that way. So, for example, I like to imagine that you ask ChatGPT, "Hey, ChatGPT, what do you do between queries?" And it answers, "Oh, I just sit there. I do nothing." Right? The behavior of a hammer who sits in your toolbox until you take out the hammer and you hammer the nail. It doesn't decide what to do. It doesn't come up with its own ideas. It just sits there. And really, what it goes to is the distinction between intelligence and autonomy. And what we see is that we've built already very effective, highly intelligent systems, particularly in narrow domains, even super intelligent, but they don't have autonomy. They don't have free will. They don't get to decide what to do. And of course, reasonable people like you, Yash, may disagree with that. So happy to hear if you want to push on that some more.
No, I was only going to push on the idea that we have free will in any meaningful sense, but maybe we can come back to that in a bit. I do want to linger on the topic of AI being a tool because I understand that utopian vision, and I think a lot of people would want something like that as well, where maybe for some things, like say driving, as you rightly point out, it would be fantastic to not have those 40,000 deaths a year and have software that will take you around. For other things like doctors and judges, it's a question of do we want AI to be trigger and making the final decision, or keep the human in the loop. And I know you've also spoken about like the importance about teasing apart intelligence and autonomy, right? Like with lethal autonomous weapons, the issue there is the autonomous part, right? It's not the fact that we're creating intelligence. That's not the inherent problem. But my question, remains that is there a reason to think that this, vision that we have of, AI just being tools for us is going to ultimately be how it is played out? Or do you think based off of, and I recognize that that is how we've used all these technologies thus far, but the fact that we're creating something that seems fundamentally different and that it's able to create or generate things and, definitely we're creating intelligence of some kind, and we can dive more into what that really means. Uh, is there any concern that you have that even if we want it to be a tool, ultimately we could be looking at, companies or governments wanting it to replace a lot of people? And you can also give us your thoughts on it replacing jobs on a large scale.
So again, I think that there are two kinds of negative scenarios, and there's plenty of negative scenarios, but there are two kinds. One is when a person or a government or organization uses AI for something bad. And the fact of the matter is, technology has already cost a lot of jobs. I like to say that so far, email has cost more American jobs than AI, because email is what allows outsourcing and offshoring and things like that. So it's clear that technology is used by organizations for negative effects, and still we that doesn't mean, oh, then everything's going to be fine. No, we need to analyze that, I'm saying. But I want to focus though on the other scenario, because for a lot of people that's the scarier one, which is AI is completely different because it's not yet another technology, it somehow takes over. And that fear is a very fundamental human fear. It goes all the way back to the story of the golem. It was actually, in some ways, always goes all the way back to Prometheus, right? In the myth of Prometheus bringing fire. We are fundamentally scared by new technologies, by powerful new technologies, and particularly by new technologies that could displace us as human. Frankenstein, the Frankenstein myth. So when we talk about this fully abstractly, people just have this visceral feeling like, oh, but it could. I think, therefore, it's more productive to identify specific scenarios and to analyze them. And when we do that, we start to see how some of these fears are not founded in fact. So let me take one. I have a fear, which I believe is well founded, that people doing bioweapons research, the weapon, the virus, whatever they're creating, could escape from the lab and result in a pandemic. And more we come to the conclusion that that actually happened. And there was actually a recent article in the New York Times. It was really fascinating. What's worse than that it likely happened is the fact that the lessons haven't been drawn, and this research continues in various places under insufficient security safeguards. So I believe if there was appropriate safeguards, probably this research could continue, but we have just this very specific problems. Now, if we shift to I believe that we can put safeguards that will stop the scenario of like you leave on Friday night, you give it some goal, you leave on Friday night, you come back Monday morning, and it's taken over the world. And there are very simple safeguards we could put into place to ward off some of these scenarios. One that I argued for in 2017, which in AI time is eons ago, is having an impregnable off switch. Of course, we should build these systems with an off switch so that you can press a button and it shuts down the same way that you can press a button on a computer, or at least pull the plug out of the wall, so we don't have 2001 Space Odyssey. I can't do that, Dave. Right? That's not what we should have. And again, I could go into additional examples. There's this kind of notion where you give it a goal. The classical paperclip scenario, which is a philosophical thought experiment, and it says, "Oh, okay, I need to produce paper clips. I'll take all the energy and all the raw materials in the world and use them to produce paper clips." But if you think about it, that's pretty silly. That means you gave it a singular goal without any regard to any other dimensions of the problem. That's just not how it works. First of all, we put bounds on what it can do. We put bounds on what it should do. And again, to go back to self-driving cars, because we can't get into every single scenario, but just to give you the sense, these self-driving cars, even, and now of course they're available in many cities, but even when they're everywhere, they're not going to decide where to go. It's not like you tell it, okay, you give it the autonomy to decide when to press on the brake and when to press on the gas so as to save people's lives. And it says, oh, I'm going to save more people's lives by not letting you go anywhere. Okay, you sit in your garage, and I'm not letting you go anywhere because I need to save people's lives. That's not how it works. It's a completely separate system that decides where to go, and the one that drives the car. And the system that decides where to go is under your control as a human. And so you mentioned doctors and judges. Absolutely, we should have a human in the loop. We have some things to work through because recent studies have shown that humans in the loop sometimes do the wrong thing, even when they have input from an AI system. But we'll figure that out. We'll have the AI system giving the doctor its diagnosis, its reasoning, and so on. And yeah, the doctor should probably be the one to make a decision particularly when it comes to high stakes scenarios.
So, a few years ago, you wrote an article titled How to Know If Artificial Intelligence is About to Destroy Civilization. And you talk about these canaries in the coal mines. So, could you start by just summing up what the argument you were making there was? And you can also refine it based on what we've come to know about AI in the years since you've written that.
One of the big debates that people are talking about constantly is the timing of it. So a while ago, people said, "Oh, it's 100 years away, it's 1,000 years away." Other people said it's 20 years away. The timelines since then have compressed even more. People are saying, "Oh, we could have AGI within a year or two." We already have AGI. All right, it's a vague term, so it's like, do we? And so I tried to use the metaphor of a canary in the coal mine, which, if you're not familiar with coal mine dynamics, actually I'm not, but I've read about it. It's you put a canary to see if oxygen is running low, and the canary will keel over and it'll warn you that. Probably now you have artificial canary, and it's like, carbon monoxide sensors, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, it's a tripwire, it's an alert that lets you know early. And I pointed out that some things, including self-driving cars, including systems that can formulate their own good questions and actually write research papers, are indicative of AI achieving next level capabilities. And I think that even for me, while I still see a lot of flaws with AI systems, the timelines have compressed. So I think we still have a long way to go. Clearview, it's not such a short distance. At the same time, I am, for the first time, thinking that, wow, maybe we will have some version of AGI within my lifetime. And again, I'm 61, so this is like definitely within your lifetime. I also very much think that our terminology here is way too coarse, right? So it's kind of like the systems today are very, very powerful, very intelligent in some sense, but as I mentioned, need to distinguish between intelligence and autonomy, which is generally not a distinction that's been made very strongly because we tend to have both. At least I believe we do. We can get into the conversation about free will. And we also need to distinguish, for example, reliable or trustworthy intelligence, because you have this intelligence that's amazing, and then you ask it the next question in a slightly different way. It's not very robust, right? It suddenly crashes and burns. Just to give a quick, for instance, I've been using ChatGPT most recently to generate all my images. And it's amazing what it can do because I can't draw, I can't illustrate, and I can create amazing things with these simple prompts. But then for a songbook I'm creating in Hebrew, I try to just put a simple Hebrew phrase, here are some of my favorite songs, on top of the image that it generated beautifully. And it can't. And it almost gets, and I'm like, you just got that one letter wrong. Can you change the last letter in the second word to be this letter? And it changes all the words. And I tried a long time, and I assure you. So it turns out, for example, this supremely intelligent system cannot make a simple change to the letters in an image. And yeah, this will be solved, but it'll be the next thing and the next thing. It can't play rock, paper, scissors very well. We could get into that story. So there's just It is right now super intelligent with amazing stupidity mixed right in.
Curiously, you actually wrote in the article, and I believe this is before, I guess many would consider GPT-3 maybe passes the Turing test, but you had written here that passing the Turing test is not one of your canaries. Why?
Because it did become clear, even when I wrote it, that our language models are becoming sufficiently sophisticated, and our ability to anthropomorphize has always been there. That combination leads people to believe. And we've all, I think, at this point, had moments where uh, we talk to the LLM and we're like, holy shit, this thing really gets it. It's actually really understanding what I'm saying. And in a sense, it is, right? And again, that's where we need to refine the words. There's a sense in which, a clear sense in which we've had tremendous breakthroughs over the last couple of years. And there's a sense in which it does not understand at all what I'm saying to it.
And in this, you also wrote that the term machine learning is actually a misnomer because machines just have a small sliver of our learning abilities, and that it's mostly AI is being spoon fed by scientists and engineers. Do you think that this applies to the large language models we've seen in the last few years as well?
Very much so. So one of the reasons I say the machine learning is a misnomer, the whole field, artificial intelligence, is full of misnomers. But the reason that is when you say machine learning, you say, okay, the machine is learning. But in fact, if you look at the full learning task, which starts by formulating, okay, what are we going to learn? And then says, okay, how do we pre-process the data? How do we label the data? What even constitutes reasonable data? Just and then when we finally go through the learning process, how do we change things so that it'll work better? That iterative, complex process is still very much human driven, where the machine is in some sense doing the last mile. Now, in doing the last mile at tremendous scale, it's very impressive, but still human driven. And the way I like to put that succinctly is the chat GPT write chat GPT? Heck no, right? It didn't do it. It didn't learn to do it. In fact, the people did it, humans and so on. And so I still think that when it comes to a full learning, uh, could you take an AI program and send it to be an undergrad at UW? And okay, you give it a pass. It doesn't have to go to parties. It doesn't have to make a decision even about crossing the street. You just expose it to the coursework the way that we're exposed to it, and you say, go forth and do the capstone classes, get A's in the classes. Again, pieces of it can do very well, particularly if it's structured and if you trained it. If you gave it all the past midterms, sure, it's going to ace the midterms and whatever, CSE 142. But that's not the point. The point is when you do the full amorphous, difficult task writ large of spending 4 years as an undergrad and being successful, no, it's nowhere near ready.
Yeah, I think the question we're dancing around a little bit is what is learning and intelligence? And I'm happy to go into that. But one thing I want to touch on, which you just mentioned, is and you write about this in this article too, which is when we talk about human learning, there are many steps involved. We have this motivation, right? You talk about, say, I want to drive a car, and then you take a plan. You decide to take driver's practice lessons. You create targets. You label data. You get feedback. You use your background knowledge. I feel we are already starting to see that on a much smaller scale in, say, the new reasoning models that have come out in the last 2 years. In that, if you prompt it something like, I want to create a program that does this, it says, okay, here are the different things that are required. It shows its thought process. Well, thought is a loaded phrase there, but we'll get into that. Well, it shows its thinking on, like, okay, here are the different things that I have to accomplish. It will go into each one, and then it will also be incorporating its background knowledge, of course, in that. So do you not feel like we're already starting to see some of these concerns be addressed by these models?
It's actually a fantastic time to be an AI these days because for decades we were building systems that didn't really work. And now we're building systems that are working in a very real sense, and we're extending them. So literally today, I was at Vercept, this new startup that I co-founded, which unfortunately is very secretive. And I was watching reasoning in real time unfold, and it was mind blowing. I was really, really excited by what I could see. But so we are making progress, real progress. There's a difference, though, between making real progress and solving the problem. So we are every day quickly getting closer to more capable systems, but we still have a long way to go.
Right, but do you feel that this is ultimately progress towards that, or that at the very least it is able to do all this formulation and planning for maybe simpler problems, right? And that for deciding the microphones for this podcast, I told Deep Research to have at it, go through a bunch of Amazon websites, reviews, Reddit, etc., and really based on all the specifications, for background noise and compatibility and everything to figure out, the optimal choices. That is a much simpler task than what we'd want to be using AI for generally. But this specific thing that, well, AI is itself not adding its own, thinking. It's simply executing what you already want. I feel we're already starting to deviate from that, in that it does have to make some choices. It might not narrate all of it, but at some level, in some sense, at the very least, it is deciding what to do in that process.
I completely agree. So AI is making a lot of decisions and a lot of decisions well. That was true even of Deep Blue, which beat the world champion in chess, and of course programs before it have to decide which move to make, and so on. And these choices that you're describing are a lot more complicated because it's called the branching factor, right? In chess, ultimately you have an average branching factor of 30. If you're even generating a document, right, there are 50,000 words, you could choose as the next word. You've got a branching factor of 50,000, and in fact, there's more and more and more. When you're generating an image, is even bigger. So it's operating in these vast spaces and making really good decisions. One of the things that schools love to do is principal for the day. They sell it at an auction, and a kid gets to be the principal for the day. They put some limits on it, but fundamentally, right? So imagine that you woke up in the morning and you said, okay, ChatGPT, you're Yash for the day. Now, here's what that means. I'm going to do everything you tell me within reasons, right? If it tells you to, close your eyes and cross the street or something even worse, you won't do that. But within reason, you tell me what to do. Now, I want you to design for me a fantastic day, and I will follow it. Again, it might do some like trite things and say, "Oh, Yash, I know you always wanted to go in a hot air balloon and da da da." But fundamentally, if you tell it to tell you how to live your life, it'll be dismal. So I'm trying to say that, sure, you give it a task. That's the answer that Picasso was talking about. But if you give it something fully amorphous, design my life, write my senior thesis for me, and make sure I get an A and it's publishable, it'll just crash and burn.
Is this a thing that in principle you believe it can't do, or is that just a limitation that we're maybe right around the corner of? And that I can definitely conceive of, an LM in the near future that when I say, hey, plan my life, as also as for it rejecting certain things, like say crossing the street, I think there are like guardrails and things like that. But that's besides the point. I'm saying for, like, hey, design my life. Yeah, it's not going to necessarily start. It might, the way Deep Research does, ask me some follow ups like, hey, what do you mean, first of all? And it'll maybe give out some suggestions and constantly talk to me to iterate through all of it. But I can conceive of that being in the very near future. Do you?
So, in principle, again, the question is easy. Of course, in principle, it'll be able to do this. So, now we're talking about full human level intelligence, maybe, and autonomy. As for the near future, I think, again, we need to define this a little bit more clearly. But let's just say not design my life. Let's just say kind of really design a great day. Because if you can design a great day, again, it's very easy to iterate. It's like, hey, you gave me a great day. Okay, do something tomorrow also great, not the same as today, because I like a little bit of variety. And weekends are different than weekdays. No, I think if you try in the near future to live by what it tells you to do, you'll find that kind of makes a mess of things. And of course, it can ask follow up questions. but it doesn't really get it. It doesn't really get what makes the perfect day for Yash.
So, when talking about artificial intelligence not exhibiting human intelligence, and you have this other article titled AI's Progress Isn't the Same as Creating Human Intelligence in Machines, you point to the fact that AI, does a lot of things that indicate we're not creating human intelligence as we go on. You point to the fact that it hallucinates, it contradicts itself, it only answers questions, it doesn't create any of its own, as we've discussed, and it spews out toxic contents. That was a problem with GPT-3 when it was released, which is what you're referring to. So it has all these problems, and we have seen it improve since then on just about all of these fronts. The hallucinations on basic facts have significantly dropped, as well as the other things. If it continues to do so, and AI has perfect behavior, and by behavior I mean the outputs that it's giving, really, on a meaningful level, not just past the Turing test in like a very simple context, but in terms of like, design my or plan like a good day for me or a good weekend, right? If it's outputting the perfect behavior from a neural network that's something like what we have now in these LMs, have we achieved human intelligence, or is there something that is missing there?
Love that question because, again, it's a very fundamental philosophical question. In computer science, what we often do is we take a problem, computer science and math, we take a problem and we reduce it to a previously solved problem, right? That's recursion or that's, NP reduction, what have you. I like to say that in philosophy, what we do is we take problems and reduce them to previously unsolved problems. So what I'm going to do with your question is I'm going to take it and I'm going to construct a reduction to a previously unsolved problem, and that's going to be my answer. So let me tell you about two things. One is when I want to do some very difficult multiplication. I'm going to multiply a trillion digit number with another trillion digit number. But you know what? Instead of doing that calculation, I'm going to simulate that calculation in a computer. It turns out that that's a distinction without a difference. If I simulate the calculation, I will have computed it and I'm done, right? I got the answer, I'm done. So there's no distinction between the behavior computation and the actual computation. It's the same thing. But let's say that I want to simulate a tropical storm and I get all the data and all the parameters and I track every particle and I, in my computer, create a perfect, by definition, perfect simulation of a tropical storm. Is it storming in my computer? Is it actually raining in there? Is it hot? Is it wet? Clearly not, right? So here we have two cases where we did perfect simulations, and in one case, the simulation was all even needed. There's no difference between the simulation and the reality. And in the other case, clearly, the simulation and the reality are not the same thing. A simulation of a tropical storm in a computer is not a tropical storm. The question you asked is the question of, is intelligence a computational process or is it like a tropical storm? And that is the question that I leave to you.
Yeah, so the way I want to go about this actually is when we talked about this, when you mentioned the storm, you talked about, is it really hot or wet, right? This is how I want to maybe tease it apart. Let's tease apart, say, qualia, experience, right? Say, what experience as in seeing, tasting, touching, experiencing a thought, experiencing an emotion, experiencing heat, experiencing the feeling of touching something wet, and computation. If we're able to tease apart, say, cognition, computation to create behavior, right, and qualia. First of all, is that for you conceptually coherent? Like, can those be teased apart?
To me, the question is, how do we engage with this topic without dealing with a tautology? So if we define intelligence, which is what we're talking about, as computation, either explicitly or implicitly, then we're done, right? Because we know that simulation of computation and computation are the same thing. So if you say intelligence is computation, then of course I can build a computer that will compute, and thereby a computer that will be intelligent. So at the heart of the question is computation, is intelligence ultimately a computation, or is qualia and experience inextricably linked? I've thought about this for so much, for so many decades. I'm no longer sure, but that's why I'm saying I'm taking this kind of cute stance of instead of answering your question, I'm going to reduce it to a different one. I'm not sure. The reason I'm doing that is not to be coy, but because I'm not sure whether it doesn't just come down to how we define the problem.
So if we were to just put aside the question of, is can this AI experience have qualia? Is there anything it is like to be the AI the way it is like something to be each of us? If we were to put that aside and think of AI as a zombie of sorts, a philosophical zombie, would you say that, okay, AI has understanding? If we are to separate consciousness just for the sake of this and see like understanding, intelligence, learning, all these things as things that emerge from a neural network or things that emerge from complexity and exhibit, interesting behavior. Because to me, the way that I have it framed in my head is I don't know if AI can ever experience, but that shouldn't prevent us from being able to say that it understands or learns or thinks. And I understand it's based on how you choose to define those things. But if we leave out the actual experience, are we then done? And are you happy to call, hey, GPT-4 understands X topic?
I think that's a very fair question that you're asking, so I won't try to wiggle my way out of it. And I would say that when you are talking about something like understanding or learning in a functional sense, meaning, does it deliver? Does it do what we need it to do? And you say, yeah, let's assume or let's believe that within a reasonable amount of time, it'll do that. Maybe some things it'll be slightly worse than you, other things it'll be better than you, but fundamentally it'll be squarely within the human realm, what it does, which is not the case today. Today it's still amazing how sometimes it just completely misses the boat. Then yes, it has the functionality of understanding. It's as useful in it. If I had the choice between the human intern or the AI intern, of course I'll choose the AI intern because it doesn't sleep and it can replicate itself 10 times. And if I need a shoulder to cry on, it'll do it better than the human intern anyway. And we've already seen that, right? It's not just functionality, right? Because its simulated empathy is as compelling as otherwise. Now, I don't know that I would choose it as my spouse. That's again a much more experiential question. But like for the relationship that I have with an intern, which is a professional relationship, can spill into some personal elements, but fundamentally it's a professional relationship. I want the best intern. AI, sign up and bring 10 of your friends and lots of compute.
Yeah, I think with the shoulder to cry on example or empathy, like there is some value we take in knowing that the thing we're communicating with is conscious. That, if I explain something to you about something that's on my mind, that you're able to experience that with me. And that's why simulating empathy versus actual empathy, I think, is an interesting conversation there. But in terms of, say, intelligence or understanding, things that are going on, I want to linger on this a little bit more because I still sense that, maybe I think I've better understood your take on understanding and experience and things like that. But I still get the sense that a lot of people, probably influenced by, say, John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, right? Uh, See that there is something more to us. Not they're not thinking about qualia. They're thinking of, say, maybe something close to like a notion of an inner self that understands, right? And I think you might fall into this a little bit too when you talk about, say, free will. That there is this inner self that is experiencing what I'm experiencing. It is generating the next thought that I'm going to think, right? And that's so there's more than what, putting quality aside again here, there's more that's going on for us to say that we're understanding something beyond just input and output to the neural network that sits in our skulls, which I find to be, key. Like the notion of the self is important in so many different ways. It's important for understanding a lot of things and making sense of things. But I feel like in cases like this, it hold us back from understanding the capability of AI because it makes us squirm to grant things to AI, including words like learning, understanding, thinking, reasoning, right? And if we just to elucidate a bit on what I'm talking about the self-creating thoughts, in that like if I were to ask you to just sit for the next minute and not think about anything or to avoid thinking about one specific thing, you can try it for a few seconds and then immediately like thoughts will start entering your conscious experience entirely on their own. And a lot of our thoughts come with the feeling that I am thinking it. That's just another feeling we're consciously experiencing amongst many other things. And some thoughts kind of come out of nowhere. We're like, oh, that wasn't me. That was just my autopilot or whatever. But in any case, there's nothing necessarily at the center of it, even though it certainly feels like there is. So I feel that we have been searching for this self or self-like thing beyond just the inputs and outputs, that we're like, we clearly have this but AI doesn't, so no matter how good AI gets, it'll just be mimicking understanding, it'll just be mimicking learning, it'll be analogous to it, but it won't quite be doing what we're doing because there's this inner thing that is understanding, that is learning and doing all of these things. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. One of my teachers as an undergraduate, Hilary Putnam, who's considered one of the great philosophers of language, said that a philosopher can be great by being very right, but a philosopher can also be great by being very wrong. And spurring a lot of thought that's fundamentally flawed. In case of John Searle, I think that the Chinese room thought experiment is absolutely fascinating. Anybody who's not looked into it really should. But I think it is fundamentally flawed. So I think that it generates a certain set of intuitions that I think are actually the wrong intuitions. But without getting into that, I just want to go to your question and say that to me, it's clear that when you take any of these words, understanding, reasoning, learning, um, it has two components, as we established earlier. It has an experiential component, and qualia, but even beyond that, just kind of a component that's personal, that has a notion of self, that has all these very human things. And it has a functional component that says, hey, well, if I understand this, I can take the test. If I reason sufficiently well, I can win the Nobel Prize. I can win this Go game and defeat the world champion. So I think that once you accept that these two components, and in people they're very intertwined, but in machines they can be quite separate, then you can start to see that, yeah, clearly a machine will have understanding primed, and understanding primed is every bit as good, probably in many ways a lot better than human understanding. And again, to be clear, I'm not talking about technology today, I'm talking about technology in the future, but it may lack that kind of that piece of the storm. And I do also just want to add, so I actually think that once you make that distinction, things kind of fall relatively neatly into buckets. And actually, the Chinese room thought experiment kind of muddles things because it tries to bring the two pieces together. But I want to talk for a second about empathy, because I think it's a really interesting case here. So I think there's something inside us that kind of reviles, kind of is repulsed by simulated empathy. Like if I have empathy, right, if I'm really upset about something, I want a genuine friend or a genuine spouse or somebody who really cares about me, who is conscious, to be empathetic. That's in fact kind of the meaning of it. And I feel the same way, but at the same time, I would not dismiss or scoff at simulated empathy. So there's a company that I've been talking to recently called Intuition Robotics, who's building a kind of empathetic LLM for old people. Now, the fact of the matter is, in our society, in many societies, it's been documented old people are lonely. It affects their health, their mental health. There are other things. In fact, there have been recent articles showing that there's an epidemic of loneliness and it's a major cause of death. And so, would it be better if they had genuine humans with them all the time? Yes. But to the extent that they don't, and there can be economic reasons that they don't, the people need to make a living, they can't, spend time with granny, or it can be social reasons that they don't, which as society has become kind of, our communities are torn apart. Whatever the reason is, it's a fact. And when you have that fact and you have technology that can deliver something that may not be as compelling emotionally, but functionally helps them feel like they've got a companion, helps them remember to take their medicine, helps them by providing a listening ear, then to use the technical term, fuck yeah, we need that. And so I used to kind of be like, oh, we really want robots helping, people. And now I'm like, yeah, we do. And last time I went to a doctor, I won't name the doctor, I got very good service, but God, was the person was busy and tired. They just operated for a bunch of hours. I did not get a lot of love, generally speaking. And had there been kind of a physician's assistant who was like, I'm really here to answer any questions you like. I'm not rushing anywhere. And let's get into this. It would have been refreshing because it was clear that all the doctor wanted to do was get me out of their office, because they were busy. And the system, the economic strictures would dictate that. So, long winded way. But you see, I'm very passionate about computers can really help us. And they can also help us emotionally with this simulated empathy.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you on that. To round this out a bit, though, my conception or the way that I like to think about AI, at least like what's helpful for me, is that I see it as, say, as we talked about, like a P zombie of sorts that understands what I'm talking about just about all the time, depending on the subject. Or I even like to think of it as it's sleep talking when it's replying to me, and that the lights are off internally, but we are getting some interesting behavior out of it. And for me, that's how I conceptualize it. I do still feel that there's probably some disagreements between how both of us are thinking about this. In that, like for example, you mentioned free will, so that is kind of the notion that there is something in us that is free, right? And that AI, it hallucinates, it contradicts itself because it's not the perfect neural network. It is not real understanding, but for us, there is this thing that is free. There's this thing that understands, etc. So, as in your next article, about evaluating AI progress, I don't sense that it would be, the way that I'm putting it. It would not be, yes, this is a fantastic model. It understands if you define understanding to be without qualia, but otherwise, if we're talking about qualia, then I don't know. I do sense that you would probably be having some kind of slightly different perspective than that, something that you still feel is missing. Do you think that that is the case? Because I think in a lot of cases, there's this kind of exceptionalism we have about human intelligence that stems, I don't know if it's necessarily a notion of a self, I don't know if it's that grand or complicated, but will your tone shift from, well, there's still this one thing that this model doesn't do, and until I see that, I'm not going to call it intelligent. Will it focus to shifting on like qualia and these other genuine questions, or is there still kind of some exceptionalism you have regarding our intelligence that I'm missing from this?
So I think I can answer that with three statements. One, when you talk about things, let's just call it qualia and experience and intrinsically human things, I don't think we have those in the machine, and there's some sense that we never will, just by definition. They're machines, we're humans. There might be interesting parallels, right? So what's the machine's qualia and how does it compare to human qualia? But I'm saying there is a difference. Number two, today, the machines are very flawed. So when I talk about the models, not flawed in the sense that they're lacking qualia, but functionally flawed. They fail all the time. And sure, we're making progress and there's fewer hallucinations, but there should be no hallucinations. And they're getting better at arithmetic, but really they should just learn the procedure and just do arithmetic. They're still very, very flawed. And Gary Marcus is one of the leading people who goes a great length to continually unearth these flaws. That's the second thing. And then the third statement, when I look to the future, and I don't have a stopwatch on me to tell you if it's 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or even 50 years from now, or even more, but in the future, and when we're thinking conceptually, 1,000 years from now is nothing, right? I mean, definitely within 1,000 years, we're going to have functional intelligence that exceeds human level intelligence. And looking forward to it in lots of ways and terrified in some others.
Yeah, I'll personally be looking forward to an article hopefully at some point saying, hey, I think this model understands or learns. But we'll see if that's ever the case. Thank you for being here. This has been a really fun conversation.
Thank you. Genuine pleasure.